People who have seen something they could never explain. What was the thing? Story 1. In my early 20s, I was home alone. I woke up to my cell phone ringing but missed the call. The number I missed the call from was my landline home phone number. I got up and found the cordless phone on the kitchen counter. I looked everywhere, but no one was in the house and the doors were all locked. Story 2. Was talking on the phone to my dad in the garden about 15 years ago. Saw an orange light slowly come up over some trees behind my house, then take off straight up at a ridiculous speed. Stood there in silence, and so did he. Explained to him what I'd just seen, and he said he'd just seen the exact same thing. He was over 100 miles away in Manchester at the time. Story 3. I was walking along a park sidewalk, blowing off grass clippings. Got under some pine trees and threw a break in the canopy, and 10-pound rock came tumbling out of the sky, bounced and chipped the sidewalk and rolled down into a creek. Strangest thing I've ever seen.
Any heavy equipment working in the general area? Big machines or parts under heavy load can sometimes just randomly yeet things quite impressive distances.
Story 4. Not me, but my dad. When I was younger, my biological mom and her husband take me and took off to another state. My dad said that he was finally starting to accept that he may never see me again after nearly a year of searching. And then one day when he was on a walk, this little girl came up to him and asked, "Are you looking for a little girl?" He looked at her, confused, and she just turned around and pointed up the block at a group of kids playing and said, "She's right there." He walked closer, past the girl, to try to get a better look and saw me in the group. He turned around to figure out what the little girl's deal was, and she was just gone, without a trace. Turns out my bio mom and her husband had come back to visit family for whatever reason. I used to call because the story is just so insane, but throughout the years it's the one story of my dad's that never changed, not one detail. He's told it so many times that I can recite it word for word, and he's always so confused when he tells it. Like I can almost see him painful his brain, searching for the most logical explanation. I was tilde 23 when it happened, and I'm now 26. He still can't piece it all together to this day. Story 5. Shortly after my mother passed away, I was going through and organizing her belongings in her room. I was talking out loud as if I were talking to her. There were some boxes with family photo albums I'd been looking for that I hadn't been able to find, and it was really worrying me. I was sitting on the floor and said aloud, "Where did you leave those albums, Mom?" Very slowly, her closet door opened on its own. A slow, creaking movement from nearly totally closed to halfway open. I was as terrified as I'd ever been in my life. I froze and didn't move, but I looked at exactly eye level, and there was a cardboard box labeled Albums in my mother's handwriting on the lower shelf of the closet. I am not a religious or even spiritual person, and I thought that there might be some imbalance in the hanging of the closet door. I went back to the door many times and tested it by wiggling it back and forth and leaving it in different positions, but it's never moved that way since. Story 6. When I was 19 or 20 and first living on my own, I woke up in the middle of the night once to a black room, but realized I could see, as if everything in my room was subtly outlined in a reddish glow. I closed my eyes and could still see the exact same thing. I then covered my eyes with my hands, but could still see. I even got up and tested it by walking around my house with my eyes closed, and was able to navigate around all obstacles and even see things like cups on the counters and able to pick them up without missing them. After a little bit of this, I turned on the light to confirm everything was where it was, and when I turned the lights back off, the effect was gone. Overall, it lasted about 10 minutes and has never happened again. My best guess is that I was still half dreaming and my brain was just able to very accurately represent my memory of where everything was. But even if that's the case, I'm very impressed with my brain's half-asleep ability to form a full 3D representation of my environment as I'm moving and manipulating small objects. Either that, or I discovered a latent superpower. Story 7. I think I was 14 at the time, living in a nice part of a very busy city. I woke up, had breakfast, and waited for my parents to come downstairs. They didn't come. I looked for them, but couldn't find them. Couldn't find my sisters either. I went outside and there was no one. Literally 0 people in an incredibly busy area on a weekend. I panicked fully. I looked everywhere for people, but they just weren't there. I fully shocked out thinking everyone disappeared. I even checked if there was something on TV about. There was live TV with people, so I calmed a bit. Other people still existed. I think it was around afternoon when I stopped looking around and walked home. When I got home, my parents and sister were luckily there. They insisted they were in and around the house all day, and I even saw them at breakfast. I broke down crying because it was simply not true. To this day, I swear people disappeared for half a day. After my breakdown, we went for ice cream, and my city was busy again. Hundreds of people doing their thing. I have no clue what happened, but I feel manipulated by life. Story 8. In college, my girlfriend had a nightmare that her pet iguana, at home with her father, had frozen and passed away after being left outside. She woke up crying, and that woke me up. I calmed her down and told her it was just a dream. We both eventually got back to sleep. The next morning, her father called to say that her pet iguana had been left outside overnight and had frozen and passed away. This wasn't a recurring dream or worry for her. This was the only time it happened. Neither of us can explain the events without the aid of religion or one in a trillion coincidence.
My mom did the same thing about the president of the Mormon church. She was Mormon back in the day. Asked my grandma if the president of the church was still alive, and grandma was like, yeah. The next morning, my mom awoke to grandma shaking her awake, madly asking, why did you ask me that question yesterday? The president of the Mormon church passed away that night, and grandma heard about it the next morning. Coincidence in my mind, but sure a weird one.
Story 9. I, 13 at the time, was about to go to bed. I was brushing my teeth in front of my bedroom window, staring into the dark, when I suddenly heard someone screaming outside. I stopped brushing so I could hear it better. Someone was screaming out my name. I sort of froze and kept listening. More voices joined, all screaming my name and laughing loudly. It was kind of like an audience at a sports game. It went on for about 5 minutes. When it stopped, I, in shock, went downstairs to my parents to ask them if they'd heard anything. It was impossible not to hear as it was very loud. They had not heard anything. I assume it was some sort of a hallucination. Still feel weird when I'm alone in my room late at night. Story 10. I worked as an under-butler in a large Scottish castle in the early 2000s. One night, I was the only person in the house and decided to throw a load of laundry in before bed. I walked down to service hallway, into the ironing room, and from there to the washing machine room. I got my laundry in, and then started to leave. I turned the lights off in the washing machine room, and suddenly everything was black. The lights weren't on in the ironing room. My first thought was, it's weird that I didn't turn the lights on in here when I came in, but they aren't on, so obviously I didn't. The ironing room had huge ironing tables, and as I started to walk through, I kept bumping into them. After a couple of times of bumping into them, I was suddenly filled with a terrible, accompanied, watched, feeling that something was there and not to look toward the sewing room, another room that came off the ironing room. I threw the ironing room back to the service hall in a panic. The hall lights were on and everything was fine. That is the whole story. I didn't see anything. However, there are some problems. To this day, I am confident that I turned the lights on in the ironing room when I went in. It wasn't possible to move through the room without bumping into things a bunch of times, as my exit demonstrated. The light in the ironing room was controlled by a very large switch that made a loud clicking noise. I didn't hear it click off when I was in the washing room. In the days that followed, the family and the butler returned home, and I had forgotten about the entire incident. A week or so later, I suddenly remembered it happening and said to the butler, "I've never heard of any ghost stories at the castle. Are there any?" He kind of dismissively said, "Oh, they say there is a white lady in the ballroom and is apparently haunted, but that's it. Oh, and they say the sewing room had one." I told the butler the story. He seemed fascinated. He told the family, and a couple of them agreed that the laundry room was unsettling. I don't believe in ghosts, and think it was likely an unfortunately timed electrical fault and an overactive imagination. Still, I'll never forget how sudden and strong the feeling of a presence was when I was on my way out of the ironing room. Story 11. I was in my 6th grade and going through the stored stuff, looking for old books, letters, scrapbooks, in the dilapidated part of my ancestral home. I swear I could see my great-great-grandfather's brother, whom I had seen only in old photos and had passed very young, from outside the window yelling at me to get out. I got scared, ran out, and the whole roof came crashing down. I share this story with friends and parents, but no one believed me till today. But I will remember this day my whole life,